Thanks everyone for joining. Good afternoon. My name is Romesh Ratnesar from Bloomberg Opinion, and I'm pleased to be moderating today's webinar on military wish lists. And before we get started, just want to remind everyone that this conversation is being recorded and will be posted online when we're done. And we will be taking questions throughout. Please, if you do have a question, put it in the chat, and we'll get to questions in due course, and hopefully have a lively conversation and exchange between all the folks on this call. So I'm going to quickly introduce everyone, the panelists, and then we'll get started. In no particular order, I'll start with Mark Thompson. He's a national security analyst for the Project on Government Oversight, and for the better part of 4 decades has been covering U.S. national security, including 20 years at Time Magazine as a senior correspondent and deputy Washington bureau chief. And I will say, someone I worked with very closely myself on a lot of stories, including coverage of the Iraq War, and I can attest to Mark's expertise and knowledge of the Pentagon and defense policy. Sheila Weinberg is the founder and CEO of Truth in Accounting, whose mission is to compel governments to produce financial reports that are understandable, reliable, transparent, and correct. She is joining from Chicago. She's well known in this town. She's testified before the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board, the Government Accounting Standards Board, and numerous state legislatures on matters of proper government accounting. We're also joined by Jonathan Bidlack, who's the director of the governance program at the R Street Institute. He oversees fiscal and budget policy there, and the legislative branch capacity working group. And he's also the creator of spendingtracker.org, which is a great site that tracks the fiscal records, spending records of members of Congress. And finally, Andrew Lautz is the director of federal policy at the National Taxpayers Union, where he helps lead NTU's work on Pentagon spending, government transparency, and congressional reform, all topics highly germane to today's conversation. So Andrew, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to ask you to just do a bit of a level set. And when we talk about military wish lists or unfunded requirements, as I think folks in the Pentagon and Congress prefer to call them, what are we talking about? How much money are we talking about? And how does this process of submitting these wish lists work?
So all great questions, Romesh, and thank you again for moderating today. Thank you, Mark, Sheila, and Jonathan for being here. Jonathan is going to pull up some slides that we put together to sort of help set the table here, some visuals that'll hopefully help our audience understand a little bit better the scale and scope of these wish lists. Let's start first with a quick overview of the Biden defense budget request, and that's the slide Jonathan went right to. Thank you. President Biden has asked Congress to give him $753 billion for defense in the upcoming fiscal year, which begins, as many of our listeners know, on October 1st. That's about 16% of total federal spending projected this year, not including net interest on the debt. But it's about 47%, or nearly half, of projected discretionary spending. This is the spending that Congress is responsible for approving every year across 12 appropriations bills. Now, while the saying goes that all presidential budgets are dead on arrival in Congress, let's assume congressional Democrats acquiesce to Biden's $750 billion request. That would be a $12.2 billion nominal increase from last year's defense budget, or about 1.5%. Defense hawks have pointed out that in real terms, accounting for inflation, this request is actually a slight cut from last year's. We're going to focus on the Department of Defense portion of the defense budget. Now, I realize that may sound confusing, but about 95% of the annual national defense request goes to the Department of Defense. That makes sense. Another 5% goes to the Department of Energy, which handles the nation's nuclear stockpile and a couple of other functions across agencies. But we're going to focus on that 95% going to DoD. Of the $715 million for DoD, you can see in the pie chart on the left, about 30% is going to the Air Force and Space Force, 30% is going to the Navy and Marine Corps, about 24% going to the Army, and the rest, the other 16%, going to defense-wide programs and activities. So Jonathan, we can do next slide. That's a general budget overview, but we should turn to the topic at hand, right? What the heck is a wish list? And that is, by the way, a colloquial term that a lot of us in civil society and some folks in Congress and in government use to describe what are called unfunded priorities lists or unfunded requirements lists. Now, Mark is going to go a little bit later into the history of all this, and he is the best person to do that. But let me tell you what the definition is in law, because Congress only recently started requiring the service branches to provide these lists annually by law. Before that, it was more of an informal practice. So the definition in law was originally from the fiscal year 2017 Defense Policy Bill, which was passed in 2016. And it called for the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, then the 4 service branches, to provide a list of unfunded priorities of the armed forces or combatant command. The service branches have to report a summary description of the priority, and most importantly for lawmakers and for the service branches, an amount of money that they'd like for that unfunded priority. Of course, the very definition of a priority gets political real fast. Just this week, Armed Services Chairman Adam Smith called out this wish list practice for trying to force lawmakers into injecting more money in the defense budget, while Republicans on the committee said the wish lists are not actually wish lists, but quote unquote risk lists. Now, during the Obama era, and it appears now during the Biden era, Republican lawmakers who are defense hawks have seen the unfunded priorities lists as a way to have the military leaders of the service branches tell them what the president or defense secretary will refuse to fund. We'll talk a little bit later about why groups like NTU and R Street and Truth in Accounting and Project on Government Oversight disagree with that perspective. But in any case, Congress has only added to the list of defense components required to hand over these lists to lawmakers every budget season. Now includes the National Nuclear Security Administration, which is within the Department of Energy, but is part of the defense budget, as we explained a minute ago. The Missile Defense Agency, the Coast Guard, the National Technology and Industrial Base, the Space Force, the National Guard, and even folks responsible for carrying out the annual audits at DoD. Let's talk about this year's wish list, though. And Jonathan, we can go next slide. Thank you. They total at least $20 billion. And we know that thanks to the reporting and aggregation from some of our friends and your colleagues, Romesh, at Bloomberg Government. The 5 service branches, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Space Force, have wish lists totaling $18 billion this year. The various combatant commands have smaller wish lists that together total at least $2 billion. And that, by the way, includes the Coast Guard. Now, if lawmakers by and large agree to these wish lists, and we have reason to believe that they might actually do so because defense spending is not constrained by any discretionary spending caps this year in Congress, we could actually see the Defense Department budget inflate by about 2.5% if Congress were to just top up the Biden budget with all of these wish list requests. I'm going to quickly go through a few highlights from the wish list. If you'll go next slide, Jonathan. So let's start with the largest single wish list, and that comes from the Navy. They have 31 total requests totaling $5.6 billion. I mean, largest request by largest dollar amount. By far the largest request in here is $1.65 billion for a new Arleigh Burke class destroyer. This is the second most costly program at the Pentagon, according to our friends at POGO, trailing only the infamous F-35 Joint Strike Fighter aircraft. Speaking of the F-35, the Navy asked for $535 million to procure 5 additional F-35 aircraft. This is despite numerous organizations, including mine, calling out the F-35 program for a whole number of concerns that really make it troubling that lawmakers are constantly asking the military to procure more and more of this aircraft. That's stuff from supply chain concerns to maintenance issues to a malfunctioning and ineffective logistics system to underperforming engines. It is concerning, somewhat concerning for us to see the F-35 in the Navy's wish list, and we'll actually see it in the Air Force's wish list too. But Jonathan, if you go to the next slide. The Army has smaller requests, but they have a lot of them, 125 total requests, which is the largest wish list by terms of number of requests of any of the service branches. They tally up to $4.4 billion. This includes $252 million for 5 more Block 2 Chinook helicopters, $100 million for a permanent barracks facility in Georgia. With all of these wish list requests, and I bring this up because of the facility in Georgia, you may see individual lawmakers or state delegations speaking up for military construction projects that will disproportionately affect or assist their constituents. So that's something to watch out for as we sort of go into defense budget season. Next slide, Jonathan. Thank you. The Air Force, they have a relatively paltry 16 total requests, but they have some expensive requests. It adds up to $4.2 billion in total. The largest slice of that pie is $1.37 billion for an additional dozen F-15EX fighter aircraft. These are made by Boeing. They're meant to replace the F-15C in the Air Force. And of course, as mentioned earlier, there's $360 million for F-35 sustainment, meaning that between the Air Force and the Navy wish list, we're actually seeing an additional $900 million for the very troubled F-35 program. Next slide. I wish I could tell you more about the Space Force's $800 million wish list request, and there's some good reporting on that, although most of this is from Bloomberg government. The Space Force reporting that we pulled from actually comes from Air Force Magazine. Again, I wish I could tell you more, but about a third of the Space Force request is for 5 classified programs that we know nothing about. So, of course, understand the need for some things in the military and intelligence agencies' budget requests to be classified, but there's also, as our friends at POGO have researched before, there's a regular issue with overclassification in the military, and so that's something worth keeping in mind when you see budget requests for classified programs. As for the Marine Corps, we know that the biggest single category request is for military construction, about $1.22 billion in total. So I think that about does it for a basic summary, and that's the conclusion of the little PowerPoint there. Romesh, I know Mark here knows more about the history of DoD wish list than maybe anyone on the planet, so I'll turn it back to you for discussion there.
Well, great. Thanks, Andrew. That was very helpful in setting the table, giving us an overview of the current state of play. So yeah, Mark, I mean, just to kind of, boil down what Andrew presented. I mean, essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, the situation is the defense secretary and the administration submits a budget proposal. The service branches then add on to that with additional requests. Is that basically how it works? Tell us a little bit about how this came to be. I mean, how did this somewhat unusual arrangement originate, and what were the justifications for it?
Yeah, thanks, Romesh. And I can never correct you if you were wrong, because you were my editor. When I started covering the military in the Carter administration, just after the War of 1812, I was covering for a Texas newspaper. And so we paid very close attention to how many F-16s there might be gotten on the QT between the Air Force, General Dynamics, and the Hill, if there was something above and beyond what was the official Pentagon budget. We had that with Vought and the A-7 Navy attack aircraft, with TI and the HARM anti-radiation missile. But it was all done sort of sub rosa. And I think what happened was, after the Reagan buildup, and everyone sort of had to start coming back down, there was a bit of a hangover. And so they began, not in a formal sense, but in an increasingly informal sense, to send these lists to their benefactors on the Armed Services and Appropriations Defense subcommittees. As things moved along, it began to snowball, and people realized, yeah, they wouldn't get 100% of what they had sought in the add-ons, but they'd get, a big chunk of that money. And the problem was, this would lead to a distorted military. Number one, these folks primarily want shiny new hardware. They don't want O&M, and O&M is what we need. hardware is nice to have, but it isn't as important as operations and maintenance. And it would lead to pork that could be better spent elsewhere, and it would lead to an imbalanced military force. Finally, to his credit, SecDef Bob Gates stepped up to the plate in 2009. And by that time, the annual wish lists were more than $30 billion. So this is what, I guess you can't really see it there, but it's bacon, it's pork, okay? And there we are. It's pork, and that's $30 billion extra. And Gates said, no, this is unacceptable. You folks are going to have to come before me and justify anything you send to the Hill in terms of unfunded requirements list, unfunded priorities list. So in very quick fashion, we went to bacon bits. And in 1 year, it went from more than $30 billion to a little more than $3 billion. And I remember talking to John Hamre, the SecDef during Clinton, about what Gates had done. And Hamre was fed up. He said, I'm sick and tired of the military begging Congress for these extra funds because it subverts the discipline of the budget process. He called it a broadly corrosive climate of indiscipline. And he blamed the military primarily, but sort of looked at Congress as the WD-40 that made this spin around. He hailed, Hamre was a Democrat, but he hailed Gates, who at the time was a Republican, for real leadership and something hugely important to restoring budget discipline. And as we debate this, the Gates episode proved two things. Number one, how malleable the brass is to civilian oversight when it's rigorously applied and justifiably handled. And secondly, just how flimsy military requirements are. I mean, I think as was said earlier on Tuesday, Jim Inhofe didn't call it a risk list, a wish list. He preferred to call it a risk list. And basically this whole debate boils down to two words: requirements and risks. And that brings us back to Gates, who had this very interesting passage when he was SecDef talking about military requirements. And he said, the problem is requirement has a particular military definition in terms of something that is required to accomplish a certain mission. And it's a little bit like one of the things I go back and forth with on the services. It's their assessment of risk. The risk isn't in terms of whether you can accomplish the mission. The risk is whether you can accomplish the mission in the timeline that the plan calls for. So the risk, Gates concluded, is to the plan. It's not to getting the job done. And so as we pay, elect politicians to assess risk, and that is what the entire assembly of a defense budget is. How much risk are we willing to accept? And it reaches a pretty bad state, I believe, in this country when the civilians overseeing the Pentagon and the civilians running the White House have this end run occurring by the collusion between the military services and their appropriators on Capitol Hill. And that's it.
Well, thanks. I mean, among other things, you've reminded me that it's lunchtime, and I wouldn't mind some bacon myself. But I wanted to ask, just to drill down a little bit on one of the points you made. The issue of just from a pure kind of operational perspective, how do these wish lists compromise or harm the ability to do strategic planning? I mean, I think you could make the argument that, well, yes, this adds to the budget, but it doesn't necessarily hurt national security. You're just, funding more weapons than the administration is requesting, but that doesn't necessarily adversely affect the military itself. I guess what you're trying to say is that it actually can have a detrimental impact on our ability to plan and move resources in a way that tries to meet the strategic objectives laid out by policymakers. I'm just wondering if you could talk about that aspect of the issue.
Sure, I think it's important to realize that veritably everything on a wish list is in the Pentagon's fit up, depending on how old you are, either the 5-year defense plan or the future year defense plan. So it's not like they're reaching, out there. They're moving things ahead by a couple of years here or a year here. Basically, though, it is harming the, remember, the Pentagon is a Title X organization. It does not fight wars. It merely trains and equips the combatant commanders to wage war. It's very important that that distinction be maintained. The Title X weenies, as they're sometimes referred to, are basically the backshop guys and gals who provide the forces needed for war fighters to actually wage war. And when you've got folks coming in and second guessing the people who have decided that this is the set we need right now, it can be very debilitating. I can recall people in the military telling me, my gosh, I can't believe they're doing that. It's going to screw up this, whether it was extra fighters or some tracked vehicle. It was just a sense of, think of the, if you dare, think of the military budget as a symphony. And I'm a nonviolent person, but there's always room for cello. And I just think it sort of screws up the entire thing if you've got freelancers going in and out. Because remember, the wish lists are not holistic. They are narrow, they are port driven, they are service driven. None of this is good for a united military operation.
Well, thanks. Sheila, I wanted to turn to you from your perspective outside the Beltway and as somebody who pays a lot of attention to issues of transparency in budgeting and accountability. What concerns you about this this practice, these unfunded requirements that are kind of tacked on to the base budget every year?
Well, to answer that question, I'd just like to talk about 3 things. 1, give a simple explanation of what these wish lists are. 2, to discuss, the budget process, is the best way. It's formalize the government spending. And 3, to discuss this short-term way that the governments are doing their budgeting, which is causing harm to our long-term finances. First, for a simple example to get people's mind wrapped around the idea of these requests, if you're a janitor at a company and you'd like to replace your simple mop with an industrial electric auto ride on floor scrubber, the cost is $6,000. It's way out of your total janitorial budget. And your bosses might like it, but your upper management won't approve the purchase. So instead of including it in your regular budget, you include it in the janitorial wish list and submit that not to your bosses, but to the company's board of directors, and hoping that they'll feel generous and give you extra money for it. But you also, in a note to them, say that the scrubber will be purchased from a person who is a major stockholder of the company who votes on the board of directors. That's what these wish lists are. And many times these items are, they entice the members of Congress to get on board with them because, as Mark mentioned, it might be for particular members of Congress's district might be producing it, or sometimes it's numerous states and numerous congressional districts that are going to produce these wish list items. To my second point, and what Mark pointed out, is that this is outside the normal budget process, which, while not perfect, is the best way we formalize our spending priorities as a whole, allowing individual service branches to press further spending demands on Congress after the DoD's overall budget negotiation process. That does undermine the ability of overall discipline in spending, and especially looking at things in a big light, big picture. The fact that this safety valve exists does undermine efficiency and productivity. And then to my third point, in relation to the budget accounting is done, the short-term budgeting on a cash basis, i.e. money in, money out, is harming our nation's long-term finances. For example, the cost of a military person, including their current pay, current benefits, and deferred benefits, such as long-term pensions and healthcare, only the current pay and the current benefits are included in the budget, not the deferred benefits like pensions and retiree healthcare. And also keep in mind, as Andrew looked at the Defense Department budget, he's not including, I assume, Andrew, the Veterans Affairs part of the budget. And I was alarmed when I spoke to David Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, and told me that the deferred benefits are actually more expensive. It's the most expensive part of people's pay. So according to the Truth in Accounting's latest Financial State of the Union, the unfunded deferred benefits have accumulated to, this is not simple numbers, to $9 trillion. And as accountants, we always believe that to manage costs, you need to account for them properly and obviously include them in a formal budget process. And I'll end with that. By not including these Defense Department wish lists and the deferred costs associated with DoD and other programs like Social Security and Medicare, taxpayers and Congress just don't have an idea of how much the true cost of government is. And as an accountant, I believe that if you don't measure things accurately, it's very hard to manage them. And that's why on our debt clock, we indicate that the national debt is at $28 trillion, but the unfunded Social Security and Medicare, if that's included, our national debt's at $133 trillion. And with that bad news, I'll end there.
Thanks. If I could follow up, and this is something, Andrew and Mark, feel free to weigh in on as well. There is this basic question of whether we really know how much of these unfunded requirements are ultimately being funded and where you can glean that information. As I recall from when we worked together on the editorial, Andrew, or when I spoke to you for it, there isn't a great kind of database that you can easily access that gives you a sense of how many of these wish lists are being granted. And if we can't find them, I think ordinary taxpayers probably have an even harder time doing so. Sheila, is that something that concerns you? And what, if anything, can be done to boost some of the transparency around this?
Yeah, no, we have difficulty finding these numbers. One thing that we do look at is, and honestly, the budget is, so voluminous and so difficult to read, and so many things. There's so many things that costs that aren't included in this budget that we actually use the audited financial report of the U.S. government instead of the budget to figure out the real true cost of the government. Andrew?
Yeah, no, great question, Romesh. When I did research for a paper that NTU did on this, we actually discovered, going through the conference reports of various NDAAs, various annual defense policy bills, where lawmakers decide whether or not to fulfill various wish list requests. There's actually, as you allude to, there's no consistency with whether or not a particular line item is reported as a wish list request, or if it is reported as a wish list request, how it is identified as such. So and honestly, the only reason that we know, and I'm not just saying because you asked, but it's because of outlets like Bloomberg Government, like Inside Defense, that make some effort every year, and often a good one, to compile, to access and compile and analyze and report on in a sort of aggregate fashion the various wish lists that are being furnished to lawmakers. So when NTU put out a blueprint for how lawmakers can improve this generally unwieldy process, we had a couple of recommendations which I want to go through throughout the our remaining time here. But one that we had was that we have encouraged the Armed Services Committee, the committees in Congress, the Senate and the House Armed Services Committees, to standardize how they report fulfilling unfunded priorities, and to perhaps locate that reporting in one section of the conference report on the NDAA, to say in, the conference report is often 2,200, 2,400 pages, but with a control F, text search, I could go in there if they had one place to report it, and I could see, and so could congressional staff and both government and non-government watchdogs could see, okay, what were the wish list requests this year that Congress fulfilled? And even better would be to add what were the wish list requests that lawmakers did not fulfill. And if it's okay, Romesh, I actually we got another question that relates, that I think I can answer with one of our other legislative recommendations. The question was, what would we say, I suppose, to someone who argues that the unfunded priorities lists are actually valuable because the services can inform Congress where investments should be made rather than Congress just, acquiescing to the president's budget or placing funding where it sees fit. Couple responses to that. I think in the first instance that Congress obviously has a robust role to play exercising oversight and scrutiny of the president's budget. I think that the hearings we're seeing with Secretary Austin, with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mr. Milley, with other service branch leaders across DoD and across the military, that's a crucially important part of oversight, right? We encourage lawmakers to continue bringing those officials in, writing letters to them, conducting oversight. And that is a more effective and ultimately less wasteful way for Congress to exercise its rightful power of the purse over the budget, rather than having these statutorily required unfunded priorities lists. I would also add that and this goes back to our legislative recommendation, if Congress did want to get a bit more technical, and if for some reason the wish list practice kept on in practice, even if and when the statutory requirements are gone, they could actually require the service branches to effectively make their wish list requests deficit neutral. In other words, they could be required to identify potential divestments or reforms or offsets that would cancel out the proposed new spending in the wish list. So that's another legislative recommendation we have. If you are going to continue this practice, even if the statutory requirements from Congress are gone, please offer some divestments or offsets that would make this more fiscally responsible.
Well, that would be a squish list.
Can I jump in on this point? Because I think it's a good one, talking about offsets. I think it's also just look, process matters. We have a budgetary process for a reason, and I think that many people who say, well, we should just go and spend more money on these certain things at the Defense Department wouldn't accept, the Biden administration saying there's a climate emergency, we need to just go and throw more money into that space, right? Or spend money on other sort of domestic priorities. So, when you think about it in a different spending context, I think, you realize why that process matters. And we have a process that is difficult for a reason, right? I mean, it's supposed to go through multiple levels of review, not just by Congress, but by the administration, by, members of the Pentagon and so on. And so as soon as you start deviating from that process, to Sheila's point from before, I think you create a whole host of other knock-on issues that, you might not have been considering. The other point I was going to make, which is just to piggyback on Sheila a little bit with respect to the long-term costs, I think that is so important here. I mean, so much of the way in which we see costs increase in all of government is because we kick new spending into motion as soon as we decide to create a program. So it's the famous Ronald Reagan line, right, about how there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. But the reality is there are a whole host of issues like this. I mean, another great example is if you just look at in Afghanistan, for example. So there's been a lot of talk recently about whether or not we should reduce or rethink our presence in Afghanistan. Well, one of the things that actually hasn't gotten as much attention is that the costs in Afghanistan at the moment aren't just, the overseas contingency funds or the direct, costs of fighting the war effort. It's also the long-term costs of healthcare for veterans, which, by the way, doesn't end just when we decide to pull out troops. And so the costs, when you look at, in this case, Afghanistan, right, are actually much more multifaceted than just what you're actually spending at that point in time on the ground. And I think that the problem in the wish list context is that even if you think that these items are appropriate or that the costs are reasonable for the immediate term, you don't necessarily know when you engage in this, in a sort of extra budgetary process, what the long-term implications of undertaking these programs are. And that's, of course, the whole reason for having a more fundamental standardized budget process in the first place. So it's bad, I think, as Mark noted earlier, from just a strategic planning standpoint, but it's also just really bad from a budgetary standpoint. I mean, you wouldn't do this in your own household finances. And I'm always hesitant to go and, to make those kinds of comparisons. But I mean, when you think about when you need to spend on something in your own personal life, you don't just go and say, well, we're going to do that and figure out how to pay for it later and not consider what the long-term implications of our family budget would be. And so, I think in this context, it is an appropriate analogy.
Yeah, and looking at like when you're mentioning the jets or the different projects that this might fund, if you build a jet, then you have to maintain that jet, and that is not included in these in these wish list costs.
You're supposed to maintain it.
I wanted to just maybe get into some of potential fixes. I think we're already sort of discussing them. It seems to me that that this issue has to be addressed maybe in two places: one at the Pentagon, and secondly in Congress. So, Mark, let's start with the Pentagon. I mean, how can the civilian leadership at the Pentagon deal with the fact that Congress is, until the statute is changed, Congress is requiring the service branches to submit these lists? What can the Secretary of Defense, you talked about what Secretary Gates did, what, if anything, should Secretary Austin or can Secretary Austin do to rein these in? I mean, if the service branches have the opportunity to submit these goodie lists, I mean, is there any reason to believe that they won't do so?
Well, that's a good question, but it also beggars the point, given the fact that Gates was able to bring these down by 90%. I know Secretary Austin was briefed on these requests, but basically the amount this year, my understanding is it's pretty much the same as it was last year. We're still at roughly 20 billion compared to the peak of 30 billion. So that's really not a big change. What you need, I think, fundamentally is a civilian leader who's willing to crack some heads and to tell the chiefs, no, I don't think you should have this on your list. Now, Congress can demand all they want, but plainly a forceful, logical, methodical defense secretary has a lot of power to curtail this. It does take political capital on his or her behalf, but it's certainly doable. And that's what was so distressing about what happened to Gates's initiative. It's almost like it's ancient history now, and we're almost back to where we were before, and as opposed to having built upon that. And regardless of whether the law is in place or not, that sort of scrubbing can happen in the building before the lists get to the Hill.
And Jonathan, tell me a little bit about, and I wonder if you could share with others on the call. I mean, what sort of engagement have you been involved in, has R Street been involved with, along with NTU, with folks on the Hill on trying to kind of raise concerns about this process and awareness about the risks that are involved here? And what kind of response have you received from lawmakers and committee staffers?
Yeah, I think Andrew can talk about a little bit more about the letter. I think there are really two audiences for this, as Mark just pointed out, which is one is sort of the changing the existing statutory requirements, right, to actually have this process be in existence. The second is having members of the military top brass, really the Secretary of Defense, working to sort of use that soft power, or if you want to call it the bully pulpit in essence, to soften the usage of this process. So I think that it's tough because I think there are a lot of people who, as soon as you start talking about the Pentagon or sort of fiscal responsibility of the Pentagon, it becomes a more difficult conversation than when you talk about other portions of the budget. And so I think, we have focused a lot of our efforts on trying to talk to people and get them to understand how if this were any other government agency or department, right, you would think about this process differently, right? It would look very different if, I don't know, the head of the EPA decided to come out and say, hey, we're going to ask for this additional money that's outside of the typical budgetary process. And I think once you start to explain it in those terms, people kind of see the problem that exists that they might not necessarily see when you're talking about it in the context of Pentagon spending. But I don't know, Andrew, if you want to talk a little bit about the response to the letter specifically.
Yeah. Well, I'll first note, on the congressional front, one of our big pushes, I think, this year is to have another attempt and a better vote on an amendment that was introduced last year to repeal the statutory unfunded requirements. The statutory requirements for the service branches to provide unfunded priorities lists. These exist in several places. We've identified it in our issue brief exactly where in the code they exist, exactly when they were required by Congress. And so hopefully we provided a blueprint for lawmakers to just surgically go in and remove those requirements in the upcoming defense policy bill NDAA debate. Representative Pramila Jayapal of Washington introduced this amendment last year. It received a standalone floor vote when the House was debating the NDAA. The amendment went down 173 to 241. Now, that sounds bad, but I'll sound a couple notes of optimism here. You had a wide variety of folks across the ideological spectrum in Congress actually supporting this amendment. You had, progressive leaders on defense spending like Representatives Barbara Lee and Mark Buchan. You had more moderate Democrats. We had one Republican, Representative Tom McClintock of California. And I actually remember specifically reaching out to his office and thanking them for this leadership here. So we're hopeful that we can work with some thoughtful Republican offices who may have not known a ton about, unfunded priorities lists before the vote came up, or may have not, even if they know a lot, they may have not have heard arguments from organizations like NTU and Our Street and Truth in Accounting and POGO for why this is a bad practice. So we want to work with those members more this year. And then you had one former Republican turned libertarian, Justin Amash, supporting this amendment as well. So I think there's a cross ideological recognition that this is a bad practice. And that at minimum, Congress can sort of repeal these statutory requirements. So we're going to be working on that this year. To address what you said, Jonathan, I'll just plug that, again, to sort of demonstrate that this has cross-ideological support. We actually put together a coalition letter to Secretary Austin, sort of actually using a lot of your reporting, Mark, from when Secretary Gates really curtailed these lists. We pointed to that and sort of urged Secretary Austin, hey, follow Secretary Gates's example and talk to the service branches and really cut down on these lists. Secretary Gates cut down by as much as 90%. We think Secretary Austin can do the same. And again, to demonstrate the sort of cross-ideological support for a move like that, we had, in addition to the four organizations represented here, we had on that letter groups like Taxpayers for Common Sense, groups like Freedom Works on the conservative side of things, groups like Public Citizen on the progressive side of things, and it was a really I think it was a really good showing, and hopefully, as we're educating members of Congress and congressional offices on this issue, we can point to that letter not only as an example of our engagement with the Secretary of Defense's office, but also as proof positive that this is not a Republican or Democrat issue. It's not a conservative or liberal issue. It is a simple good government and good budgeting issue. And so that is my note of optimism for this debate over the next few months.
And Andrew, at Truth in Accounting, we just don't think these lists should exist. And if they have to have them, then there should be a law put in place to restrict the items. I guess my question again, and I was surprised that when I was speaking to David Walker, that he was saying that that members of the military cannot lobby Congress, but they can educate them. So do you think that this education, process on the Hill is, influencing the members of Congress to keep this practice going, or for specific items?
I think one challenging dynamic here, to be frank, is the partisan divide in Congress. I think one uphill battle we have is convincing our Republican friends that there are a lot of good and really robust ways to exercise oversight over the Biden administration, over the Biden Defense Department, over Secretary Austin, without resorting to a practice that's going to put upward pressure on the defense budget when we are trillions of dollars in debt, when we have spent trillions of dollars in the last year on COVID relief and COVID aid, when we could be approaching in the coming years a debt and deficits crisis. That this is a practice that puts upward pressure on the defense budget, especially in an era when the Budget Control Act is expiring, and as congressional and budget wonks know, this is going to have the potential to open up the floodgates on discretionary spending, because there's no longer discretionary spending caps that were in place for the last 10 years. To Jonathan's point earlier, and Jonathan, if you want to jump in here, please do. But it is harder to get Republicans and some more hawkish Democrats in Congress to critique the size of the defense budget. We've heard a lot of critiques from Republicans over President Biden's proposed 16% increase in non-defense discretionary spending for fiscal year 2022. And at NTU, we're concerned about several aspects of that as well. But we think we think that even a flat defense budget is not pursuing the real reductions necessary to right-size the defense budget for the future. And so that's the challenge we're facing. Jonathan?
Yeah, I'll just reiterate your point about putting in check sort of future growth in spending, because I think it really hits to a point that when a lot of people think about, mainly on the right side of the aisle, when they talk about restraining the growth in the federal budget, they're always kind of thinking generally about the here and now and ignoring what it looks like, what the situation looks like down the road. And that includes, both the consequences of past legislation or past things that have been past actions, but it also includes, new stuff. And so I think that when we talk about having a Pentagon budget that reflects our real threats and nothing more, we need to also be thinking about not just in the here and now, but in the future. And I think there's a big danger to kind of setting in motion programs that, even theoretically could have value today, but may not have value down the road. And if we're making these decisions in a way that doesn't account for those future needs, that only works to also expand the budget even to the point where it crowds out resources that in the future could theoretically be going toward things that are more urgent national security threats. So there's, it's important not to just think about this from the standpoint of, we just want to cut the budget or whatever, or this is, government is bigger than we want. Like, the real problem here is that you want government expenditures to reflect the underlying needs that you have. And to the degree that you're creating processes that inject, waste into the existing process, then you're just harming yourself down the road. You're making it more difficult to be able to adequately respond to what may be very real threats in the future. So anyway, I think the forward-looking component is a very, very important message to take away.
Yeah, and that's why we don't like the cash basis accounting that's done in the budget. The IRS doesn't allow a corporation that makes more than $20 million to do their to do their accounting this way, but yet the federal government does their accounting that way, the budgeting that way. And we call for, us accounting term, a full accrual budget where you have to include, okay, this Congress is making a decision and you need to know what, and they need to be accountable for the current financial effect of that, but also accountable for the long-term financial effect of that. And the way we do our budget, since it's not on the full accrual basis, doesn't provide them with the correct information.
Well, I think we've reached pretty much the end of our time. I just wanted to reiterate what others have said. I think Chairman Milley yesterday said something like he never, in all of his years of being involved in budgeting, ever come across a time when resources exceeded requirements. Essentially, we always have more things that we want to do or need to do than we have resources to pay for. But part of budgeting governance is making those choices and setting priorities, and that's something that we are not always so good at doing. But I think the conversation here has been incredibly enlightening for all of those of us involved with it, and I think it's a conversation that will continue and should continue. So thanks, Mark, Sheila, Andrew, Jonathan, and thank you everyone for joining, and we hope to see you at the next one.
Thank you, Romesh.
Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.
Thank you.